Hello everyone and welcome back once again. This is your history teacher here, and this time I am here with a new chapter of NCERT Grade 7 History, that is Rulers and Building. Students, do you know that the Qutub Minar is 5 stories high with a band of inscription in Arabic under its first balcony? And students, the first floor of Qutub Minar was constructed by the ruler Qutbuddin Aibak in 1199, whereas the rest part of the Qutub Minar was constructed and completed by the ruler Iltutmish around 1229. Students, as I said that the Qutub Minar's construction was started in 1199. So, over the years, it was damaged by lightning and earthquakes, but later it was repaired by many rulers like Alauddin Khalji, Muhammad Tughlaq, Firoz Shah Tughlaq and Ibrahim Lodi. So students, in this chapter, we are going to learn and discuss about some major architectural construction that fascinated the world with its beauty. And not only this, in fact, we are also going to learn some important facts about them. So, let's start. So students, the first heading of this chapter is Rulers and Buildings. Students, between the 8th and 18th centuries, two kind of structures were very common during that era that were basically built by kings and officers. And students, these kind of structures are firstly forts, palaces, garden residences and tombs that are safe, protected and grandiose places of rest in this world. And secondly, the structures that are meant for public activities, including temples, mosques, tanks, wells, caravansarais and bazaars, means to say markets. And students, you will amazed to know that these kind of constructions were not only constructed by the kings and the rulers, in fact, the rich traders, merchants also constructed these kind of buildings. And students, the common people expected from the kings that the king should care the public subjects, and hence by building such kind of structures for the use and comforts of the people, the kings and the rulers wanted to get praise from the common people. And that's why, in order to get the praise from the people, kings used to construct such kind of structures for public welfare. And students, do you know how the students came to know about that? Because there are many temples, mosques and wells that are still survived from the 18th century. And from these structures, the historians came to know that these buildings that are generally constructed for the public welfares were not only constructed by the kings and the rulers, in fact, the merchants and the rich traders also constructed these structures for public welfare. Now students, let's learn and understand the engineering skills and the constructions that the rulers and the kings used that time. Students, the monuments of that time shows the technological skills of the time they were built in. For example, a superstructure needs a lot of skill and resources to build. For an example, a roof. Students, to build a roof, the architects of that time manufactured the roof by placing wooden beams or a slab or stones across the 4 walls, as you can see here in this image. And students, however, to make a large room with elaborate structures required more sophisticated skills. So, between the 7th and 10th centuries, the architects added more rooms, doors and windows to buildings. And that time, the roofs, doors and windows were made by placing a horizontal beam across two vertical columns, as you can see these kind of structures in the present time in your houses. And students, this kind of architecture is called as tribate or corbelled, in which the roofs, doors and windows were made by placing a horizontal beam across two vertical columns. And students, that time this kind of architecture were generally used in constructing temples, mosques, tombs and that kind of buildings that are attached to large step wells, means to say baulis, as you can see here. And students, these kind of structures are very prominent between the 8th and the 13th centuries. Now students, let's learn that how the temple were constructed in the early 11th century. Students, generally the temples and the mosques were beautifully built because as they were places of worship and also demonstrated the wealth, power and devotion of the patron. For an example, the Kandarya Mahadev temple that was constructed by the king Dhangadeva of the Chandela dynasty, that was dedicated to Shiva in 999. And students, this Kandarya Mahadev temple, this one over here, this is the Kandarya Mahadev temple. It had an ornamented gateway that leading to an entrance and the main hall. And students, the main hall were also known as Mahamandapa, where basically the dances were performed. And students, the main chief deity was kept in the main shrine of the temple, that were also known as the Garbhagriha. And students, this Garbhagriha is that part of the temple where only the ritual worship were performed by the king, his immediate family members and the priest. In the same way, the Khajuraho complex also contained royal temples. And students, during that time, in these temple complexes, the commoners were not allowed. And all these kind of temples were decorated with elaborately carved sculptures of different deities. Students, similarly, like the Kandarya Mahadeva temple and the Khajuraho complex, the Rajarajeshwara temple at Thanjavur has the tallest shikhara. Students, do you know what is shikhara? Students, the topmost part of a temple that you see here, this one is known as the shikhara, or we can say shikhar of the temple. And students, during that time, it was not easy to construct these kind of shikhars because there were no crane in those days, and so it was too heavy to lift manually the 90-ton stone for the top of the shikhara. So students, that time when there was no crane, so architect built an inclined path, means to say a path that is not too steep. So that time the architect used such kind of inclined path that is started over 4 kilometers away to the top of the temple in order to place the boulder on rollers and roll it all the way to the top of the temple. And student, once the shikhar was installed at the top of the temple, then this inclined path was again dismantled after the temple was constructed completely. But students, the residents of the area where generally these kind of huge temples were constructed remember the experience of construction of the temple for a long time. And even now, a village near this Rajarajeshwara temple called Charupalam is also known as the village of the incline. And do you know why this village is also called the village of the incline? Because the inclined path that were constructed in order to construct the shikhar of this Rajarajeshwara temple were gone through this village. That's why this village is known as the village of the incline. Students, during their excavation, the archaeologists also noticed two technological and stylistic developments from the 12th century. As the first one is the arcuate style of architecture. Students, in this arcuate style of architecture, the weight of the superstructure above the doors and the windows was sometimes carried by arcs, as you can see here, in the form of arc. Secondly, the archaeologists noticed that during that time, high quality limestone cement mixed with stone chips that hardened into concrete. And students, this kind of concrete were used that time. That helped them to make the construction of large structures easier and faster. Now students, the next heading of your this chapter is building temples, mosques and tanks. Students, as I said earlier that temples and mosques were beautifully built because they were the places of worship and also demonstrated the wealth, power and devotion of the patron. As for an example, the Raja Rajeshwara temple. This one over here is the Raja Rajeshwara temple that was constructed by Raja Raja Deva for the worship of his god Raja Rajeshwaram. And students, do you know why the king took God's name? Students, during that time the kings took God's names because as it was auspicious and showed that the status of the king was equal to that of gods on earth. And students, not only this, in fact, through rituals, it shows that the one God, means to say the king, worships the another God, means to say the heavenly God. And that time, the large temples were generally built by the kings, whereas the smaller temples were built by nobles or the subordinate kings. And students, these smaller temples indicate the miniature model of the world that ruled by the king and his allies. Students, whereas the Muslim sultans and the Badshahs didn't claim themselves as the incarnation of gods like the Hindu kings and rulers. In fact, the Persian court chroniclers describe the Muslim sultans and the Badshahs as the shadow of God on earth. For an example, the inscriptions Quwwat al-Islam Mosque in Delhi explain the god chose Alauddin as a king because he had the qualities of Moses and Solomon, who were the great lawgivers of the past. And they believed that the greatest lawgiver and the architect were created by God. And God created these kind of lawgiver in order to introduce the order and symmetry in the world of chaos. And in fact, the Persian also says that the greatest lawgiver and architect is God, who himself created the world out of chaos and introduced order and balance. And students, as each new dynasty came into power, kings emphasized on their relation to God, and so rulers offered patronage to learned and pious men and transformed their capital into religious and cultural centers. And students, do you know why the kings transformed their capitals into religious and cultural centers? Students, the kings do so because it brought fame to their rule and their realm. For an example, Sultan Al-Tatmish constructed a large reservoir just outside Delhi Ikkuna called Hauj-e Sultani, or the King's Reservoir, in order to brought fame. And students, the rule of a king in ancient time was also considered an age of plenty, means to say where all resources are available in plenty, especially water. That's why the kings built tanks and reservoirs in order to provide clean water to their subjects. And students, these tanks and the reservoir were part of a temple, mosque, or gurudwara. Students, do you know what is gurudwara? Students, a gurudwara, a place of worship and congregation for Sikh, like us in temple. Now students, let's learn and discuss that why the temples were targeted in past time. Students, as I said earlier, that these temples were built in order to demonstrate a king's devotion to God. And students, in fact, not only the king's devotion to God, in fact, their power and wealth also. So, when kings attacked each other, they targeted temples because they were a symbol of the king's wealth and devotion. As for an example, in the early 19th century, a Pandyan king named Srimara Shri Vallabha invaded Sri Lanka and defeated the king Sena first. And student, this Pandyan king Srimara Shri Vallabha took with him jewels, gold and precious wealth of temples, especially a huge golden statue of Buddha that was entirely made up of gold. And students, do you know how the historians came to know that? Students, there were many manuscripts written down by the Buddhist monk and the chroniclers of Dhammakiti of that time who wrote down this in their manuscripts. But students, later the next Sinhalese ruler Sena II attacked the Pandyan capital Madurai in order to take the revenge of the invasion of Pandyan king Srimara Shri Vallabha. So, when the next Sinhalese ruler Sena II attacked the Pandyan capital Madurai, he took the Buddha statue back home, means to say Sri Lanka. Students, similarly, in the early 11th century, a Chola king named Rajendra I built a Shiva temple in his capital. And students, Rajendra I filled this temple with prized statue that he seized from the defeated ruler. And students, the prized statues that he seized from the defeated rulers included sun pedestal from the Chalukyas, a Ganesha statue and several statues of Durga, a Nandi statue from the eastern Chalukya rulers, and an image of a Bhairava, means to say a form of Shiva and Bhairavi from the Kalingas of Orissa. In the same way, a Kali statue from the Palas of Bengal. So students, these were the prized statues that were seized by Rajendra I from the defeated rulers. And he placed all these prized statues in this Shiva temple. But students, during the 11th century, Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni raided India and looted many temples, out of which the most famous loot is of the temple of Somnath in Gujarat. Now students, let's learn and discuss about the gardens, tombs and forts. Students, the Mughal architecture was very complex because almost all the Mughal rulers, including like Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir and especially Shah Jahan, were personally interested in literature, art and architecture. That makes the Mughal architecture very complex. And in fact, in Babur's autobiography, he describes his interest in plan and laid down gardens within rectangular walls and divided into 4 quarters by artificial water channels. And students, Babur called these garden Char Bagh garden, means to say Char Bagh or four gardens, because of their symmetrical design into quarters, as you can see here in this way. And students, later, like Babur, Akbar, Jahangir and Shah Jahan also built some special beautiful char baghs in Kashmir, Agra and Delhi. Students, during Akbar's reign, architect used Timur's tomb as their inspiration and built central towering domes and tall gateways that were also known as pishtaq in their structures. In the same way, Humayun's tomb was also placed in the center of a char bagh, and inside the tomb there was a central room surrounded by 8 other rooms. And students, this arrangement of 8 rooms was called Ast Bisist, means 8 paradises. And the Humayun's tomb building was constructed in totally red stone and with white marble. Students, whereas during the Shah Jahan reigns, the architecture in Agra and Delhi flourished, as the Diwan-e-Khas or Diwan-e-Am, means to say public and private halls, were built carefully within a large courtyard with 40 pillars, and that 40 pillars were known as Chehil Sutun, that was generally used as support. And students, Shah Jahan audience hall resembled a mosque, and the throne was often called the Qibla, means to say the direction faced by the Muslim at prayer. And since then, all courtiers faced him during court sessions. And students, do you know why the throne was often called the Qibla, or why the direction of the throne is towards that direction where generally Muslim faced during their prayer? Because it suggested them as an idea that the king was a representative of God on earth. And students, not only this, during his reign, Shah Jahan also emphasized in the connection between royal justice and imperial court in his newly constructed court in the Red Fort at Delhi. And students, here at the Red Fort in Delhi, behind Shah Jahan throne, there were Pitradira inlays that depicted Greek god Orpheus playing the lute, as legend says that his lute can silence the fiercest of beasts and makes them peacefully coexist with humans. And students, the Shah Jahan's audience hall were constructed under the aim to communicate that the King Justice would be equal for each and every section of the society, where all could live together in harmony. Students, during Shah Jahan in Agra, the nobles built their homes near the river Yamuna, and the char baghs constructed here were also as riverfront char bagh, because as the homes were built on the edge of the garden near the river instead of the center of the garden. That's why these were known as riverfront garden. Students, similarly, Shah Jahan also adapted this way of architecture, or we can say technique, when he built the Taj Mahal, where a mausoleum was placed on a terrace by the edge of the river and the garden to its south. And students, Shah Jahan develops this architectural form as a means to control the access that nobles had to the river. And students, when Shah Jahan constructed the new city called Shahjahanabad, he built his palace on the banks of the river and allowed only special nobles to access the river, and all others had to build their homes in the city far from the river. For an example, his eldest son Dara Sikho got the right to build his palace near the river, whereas all others had to construct their homes in the city far away from the river Yamuna. Now students, moving on towards the last topic of your this chapter, that is region and empire. Students, between 8th and 18th century, the construction activity increased. Or we can say that as architecture prospered between the 8th and 18th century, many ideas were exchanged between different kingdoms. As for an example, in Vijayanagar, the elephant stables of the rulers were strongly influenced by the style of architecture found in the adjoining sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda. In the same way, in Vrindavan near Mathura, the temple were constructed in architectural style that were very similar to the Mughal palaces in Fatehpur Sikri. And students, as large empires were created, culture and artistic styles cross-fertilized to create a fusion of art and architecture. As for an example, the local rulers in Bengal built a thatched roof that was used later in Mughal architecture as the Bangla Dome. Similarly, many buildings in Akbar's capital at Fatehpur Sikri followed the architectural style of Gujarat and Malwa. Students, although by the 18th century, the Mughal Empire declined, but their architecture style still inspires many buildings and constructions even today. Now students, that's all about your chapter number 5, and with this topic here, your chapter number 5 is completed. Now, I will be come back soon with another chapter. Till then, stay home, stay safe and stay healthy.